Without answering the humans' demands or any further provocation, the ships who had just descended upon Orion's fusion satellite almost immediately sent out their fighters. The swarms of small crafts spread out like clouds from their harboring ships, immediately dispersing wide to minimize the effectiveness of any area of effect weaponry. The alarms of the Salem were blaring, and already every available pilot was rushing to get their own crafts out into the void before the advantage of the enemy would be too great. "What can you tell me about those ships?" Commander Keown asked loudly, his eyes glued to the emerging murder of hunter jets, while the officers of his ship got the Salem combat ready. "GWS Model 26, Engine Shaw replied, as quickly as if she had been queued up and ready to answer the question. Keown couldn't help but grimace as he heard it. GWS Galactic Warships. Those were communal models. The kind that, usually, only the galactic community's top leadership had the authority to send out. There was no way the Galactic Communal Network Agency could have brought those out. And there was no way that the current Galactic Council would have agreed to this sort of use of force to defend a supposed repair either. Whatever was going on here, it went deep, deep down. As technical members of the communal military themselves, the UHSDF, of course, had access to at least the vague schematics of the galactic warships, and so Keown quickly called them up to inspect what they were dealing with. Model 26s were no joke. Thick armor, lots of compartmentalization to avoid decompression, countless redundancies in the systems, and enough firepower to glass a planet's surface if they had to. Granted, only over time. However, his war-class Salem was quite far from the size of a planet as well. And all that wasn't even mentioning the hundreds of fighters each of them could hold. "There's a possibility that they are stuffed floor to ceiling with those shield bombs," a lieutenant chimed in warning. And Keown had to agree. If they were this bold facing human ships, chances were good that they had brought the one thing that had proven to be at least somewhat of a countermeasure against humanity's very own relativity fire. Sure, those things were only able to eat one single shot of the bigger cannons, but in all honesty, what else in the galaxy could claim of itself to block a shot of a relativity weapon? "Do everything within reason to stay at range," Keown ordered. "Do not let them get close, but don't let them break through. We need to protect the satellite at all costs." "Yes, sir." It echoed back to him from the entire bridge. In a bright flash, something that looked like an incredibly dazzling shooting star zipped right by the viewing window that showed them the sight of the galaxy. It was quickly followed by a second one of the same kind. Then another. Then another. Within a heartbeat, a rain of light flew past their view, soon forming a spiderweb that spread through the void. All the while, the hyperspace sensors measuring the surrounding space went crazy from the sheer number of stretches that were generated, jumping up and down in intensity like sound bars during a speed metal song. "Good luck out there," Keown silently wished, as he watched the ever-amazing spectacle of the Unkindness class jumping into battle. Reaching to the side, he opened direct communication to the commanding ship of their three-point defense formation, intending to ask if there were any news of possible reinforcements from Earth. However, as if it had only waited for its cue, a sudden alert message interrupted him in the motion as it flashed up on his screen, delivered directly not from a specific sender, but from the UHSDF's very own emergency services. "Attention! Numerous unpermitted short-range hyperspace stretches detected within Earth's space. Originators unresponsive. Prepare for military response." "Earth 2!" Keown couldn't help but let out as the message came in. Were they insane? Earth was a fortress. Even with a possible numbers advantage, there was no way anyone would be able to just bring the fight to humanity. Hell, half of those stretches would be collapsed before they even got close to the planet. However, biting his cheek, the commander glanced out of the window once more. If even Earth itself was in danger right now, chances were they weren't the only ones, and that might well mean that reinforcements would be a thing of the past. "We've got incoming!" a lieutenant suddenly shouted, his eyes constantly glued to every sensor they had that measured in fine enough ranges to tell them about enemy activity. No message, no warning, no nothing. They had simply started shooting. "Return fire!" Keown loudly ordered, even though it was not technically necessary. Outside of extremely fringe circumstances that had to be specifically declared, every UHSDF soldier had the right to return fire when they were shot at, and they all knew to do so quickly before they couldn't anymore. Blowing up in bright, bulbous spheres, the barely known energy projection weapons their opposition had begun to use ever since the attack on Gewalitan joined their own hyperspace jumps in lighting up the void, turning this entire system into bright day. Even the light of the enormous stretch the fusion satellite generated was overpowered, as more and more physics-defying weaponry was employed by both sides. The Salem's front window dimmed heavily to compensate for the dangerous light levels, soon resigning them to proceed the battle through their monitors alone, but not before they got to witness the Trail of Tears unload its main cannon. The ensuing beam of light was as thick as 5 of those the smaller ships produced, and it blasted right through the center of one of the GWS with a single massive hit before the slowest of the attackers had mustered their defenses. The entire ship was thrown aside, spinning heavily, as a molten hole burned right through its middle, leaving it to hover off course and, at least for the moment, drift out into space. Then, the view went black, and everyone quickly turned their gaze to their screens to not lose sight of the battle. Meanwhile, in a far more secure location, situated in nigh absolute secrecy, Dr. Stanislaw Santo, in his own right Fleet Admiral of the UHSDF, stood in front of an entire wall made up of a total of 20 screens that were constantly displaying various sources of critical information. The most critical of which right now was the early approach system that kept a tight watch over any hyperspace stretches that encroached on human space, or had the capability to allow someone to do so once exiting them. While the sophistication of this system had been a surprise to people in the past, its presence and function had by now become rather common knowledge, which likely led to the specific approach of invasion they were witnessing now. Judging by everything they saw, these ships had gathered in the neighbouring territories of the Stierulish, right on the borders of the galaxy's Perseus arm. From there, they had moved comparatively slowly through the use of short, sporadic jumps that weren't as easy to detect as any large hyperspace stretch would have been, before then skipping the rest of the way before they would enter certain detection range with one last still short-ranged but more decisive jump. No two ways about it, this was a planned invasion of their space with zero possibility of confusing it for anything else. Otherwise, such a maneuver would have been utterly insane. Well, that wasn't to say it wasn't still insane, even as an ambush. Despite the sudden appearance of the encroaching stretches, the UHSDF was more than prepared to deal with threats such as this. Injecting small stretches of their own directly into those approaching, they had immediately sent out a warning. "Identify yourself and cease your approach or be deemed an invader." Out of the 255 total stretches, that would bring at the very least an equal amount of ships, a grand total of 0 had responded to the warning. So unless they were incapable of receiving or sending any sort of messages or stopped their approach, they were most certainly hostile. Shots were already being fired at the ships the UHSDF had sent out to defend the local fusion satellite, and they were receiving news from their neighbouring allies that they too were registering unpermitted invasion into their territories. As there had to be for anyone with a conscience, there was a part of the Fleet Admiral that wanted to wait. Wanted to allow these ships to approach and to make 1000% sure that they were hostiles before he would allow any attacks on vessels who were supposed to be their allies, at the very least in name. However, he had to think of Gewalitan, he had to think of Dunama, had to think of Net Staniot, had to think of the GCS, and now even of the Council Station itself. Brutal, unprovoked attacks were not a distant worry anymore. They weren't a fearful fantasy. They weren't even out of the norm. And as Fleet Admiral, he was responsible for the lives of those who served on the vessels under his command. His hesitation could mean the families of those entrusted to him would never see their child, their parent, their sibling, their spouse, ever again. Only for those who took them to then die either way. And this was a premeditated attack. "Give them one last chance to cease their approach," he fully communicated as a general order. Although he spoke with conviction, the man had never felt as elderly as he did at that very moment. "If they do not comply, collapse all the hyperspaces you can reach. We will not compromise the safety of our citizens for the sake of decorum." He glanced over to the heavily secured feed that displayed to him the current state of the UHSDF in its literal meaning, the fleet itself. Viewing things in their totality, 255 attacking ships were not a realistic threat to their full forces. However, given the current galactic climate, their new ally ship with the Miat, and the constant need to still defend the Orion Alliance's borders, even in their outer territories, the fleet was stretched a lot thinner than it would have usually been. Space was a big place, after all. And thus, such a concentrated attack did demand to be met with a strategic mind, lest they'd suffer far more losses than would be necessary. However, possible losses or no, there was one thing that was more than certain. After what they had seen in the past, none of these ships would be allowed to get even in viewing distance of any inhabited planet in the system. That he would throw his own life in the balance for. And so he looked upon the display, watching as those of his ships that were within range came together in formation around the unnatural intrusion into their space. "Not on my watch," he decidedly said to no one in particular, folding his hands behind his back. Mrs. Cohen counted heads as one massive furry body after the other dashed along, squeezing right past her legs as they ran into the building and immediately down into the basement. 15, 16, she thought to herself, making sure not to miss a single one so none would be left outside. Then she scowled. "That's only 16. Lifting her head and shielding her eyes from the sun, she looked around. Where could the other three have run off to? She brought her fingers down to her lips and released a piercing whistle that echoed across the compound. "Hear her!" she commanded loudly in a very strict tone, hoping that would be enough to convince the last of the dogs to get their furry behinds moving. Darn it, she had focused so much on counting that she hadn't fully paid attention to which ones were inside already. She had definitely seen the Cane Corso, the Great Dane, the Malamute. A loud rattling and scraping of metal informed her that Nico had finally gotten the last of the cats to cooperate, even if a very displeased half-roar told of the tiger's displeasure about being locked away outside of his usual times. However, he had still followed the bell that was meant to call him inside, which is more than she could say about those darn dogs. Claudia whistled again, hoping against hope that the parts would obey before she had to search them across the entire compound. However, the only one who came trotting over to her was Nico. "That was the last one. We should go," he said, with some urgency in his tone. His wife, however, shook her head. "We're missing 3 dogs," she said, before whistling again, and she once more shouted the recall command. "What's up with them?" she wondered. Sure, the dogs weren't usually meant to go inside the house, and thus they weren't really used to it. However, Finn and James had also trained the beasts, to the point where they could quite easily trust each of them to carry a sausage after them for the entire day, without any worry about that treat having even a piece of it missing by the end. So them not listening was a bit odd. Nico exhaled through his nose in a clearly stressed manner and reached to check his phone. The alarm was still going, with no signs of things coming down any time soon. "I don't like this," he said. "We should go." Once again, Claudia shook her head. "Not before we found the last 3, she said, which caused her husband to sigh. Lifting her fingers again, she was about to let out yet another whistle, but the sound died on her lips when the action was cut off by a loud howl. She let the air out in a long, exasperated blow instead and shook her head. She knew that howl, and it was certainly a form of protest. "I know the inside is warm and cramped, but I am not having it with you," she loudly announced as she began to march in the direction the howl had come from. She passed the fence into the outer area and walked in between the now currently empty enclosures of Lion and Jaguar before the large furry bodies came into view. Separating himself from the 2 others, the large wolf hybrid by the name of Kanai immediately howled at her to proclaim that he was not following her command right now. "Ah!" Claudia immediately shushed him and pointed behind herself. "Basement! Now!" Kanai howled once again in protest, before then bouncing on the spot and trotting back over to where the other 2 missing dogs were currently settled down, laser focused on some spot in the grass. Both the Leonberger Otto and the Anatolian Shepherd Akatan had their massive heads laid on the ground, the tips of their snouts about 30 centimeters away from each other as they stared down at something in between them. Meanwhile, Kanai pranced and hopped around them in a circle, always keeping a distance of about half a meter while he huffed and yapped. "Hey!" Claudia called loudly as she jogged over to the strange display. "Get up! I said inside!" Finally, the dogs actually reacted to her, lifting their heads up to look in her direction and letting out mild huffs before then looking back down to the patch of grass in front of them. Claudia frowned. "What are you—" she began to ask, but then just sighed deeply as her eyes fell upon the spot right in between the two masses of canine. There, in the grass between their snouts, lay a tiny little kitten, small enough to fit in a cup. It was a little calico, and the poor little thing seemed to struggle to even move through the grass while the two giants gazed down at it, their snouts larger than its entire body. "Where did you find that?" Claudia couldn't help but ask, even if the dogs probably weren't going to answer. Therefore, she quickly shook her head and placed her hand on her hip. "Oh, never mind. Leave it." She pointed to the house once more. The dogs simply looked up at her with big doe eyes and waggled their tails gently. What they didn't do was move. Claudia grumbled a bit. "Oh, I bet if I were Finn you'd listen," she exhaled, before deciding that she didn't have time for interspecies debate. "Fine. Here." With that, she bent down and scooped the kitten right into her hand, hoping the feline wouldn't make her immediately regret it. "Now go," she said, hoping that their brains would fire up when the distraction were removed. And, even though she had only half expected it to work, the dogs basically jumped to their feet and then booked it right back to the house, when Nico quickly led them inside, and then made sure to lock the dogs up in the basement. Claudia looked after them just a bit baffled. Then she glanced down at the almost pitiful little thing that seemed to still be processing its sudden change in elevation. A sudden realization hit her, and she couldn't help but sigh one last time, half in amusement, half in frustration. Apparently, dogs really were like their owners. "Claudia!" Nico suddenly called out to her, waving the hand he held his phone in, reminding her that the alert was still going on, and that now was really a good time to get to a safer location. Giving the kitten one more glance, she gave it a little "hope you make it" nod before hurrying over to him, and carrying it down to the other animals and setting it next to Spinach, who ported it with some confusion but seemed otherwise accepting. Then she hurried out the door into the car, really hoping the house would still be standing the next time they came back. Moore exhaled heavily, brushing her claws through the fur around her neck in anxiousness, as she and Quiz once again waited behind yet another stage, anticipating for her old friend to be called out in front of the awaiting audience, both present and at home. Quiz sure kept themselves busy, ever since they had ascended to the council, and although Moore was happy to accompany and support them in the endeavour, much like she had accompanied James for such a long time, just like with James, she had to admit that she was beginning to find it a bit hard to keep up with the Andalia's energy. Although right now, that wasn't really why she felt so nervous. "I do hope Avesalon manages to resolve the problem like she expected to," the old Raphaelite finally said, keeping her tone quiet and her voice vague, knowing fully well of the possibility that cameras were on them even now. Until the time they could be sure the situation had been dealt with, she knew it was better to not alert any unnecessary parties to the idea that something as perilous to galactic freedom as the remains of an Infamous realized was likely being used as a weapon. Still, she couldn't fully help herself. She simply had to speak about it before she would explode. Quiz glanced up at her. "You sound afraid," they commented in sign, tilting their head as they tried to make eye contact with their much larger companion. Moore sighed. "Of course I am," she replied, not necessarily appreciating them pointing out the obvious. "After all, it is a—" She cut herself off, realizing that she may have been about to say too much. Chris released a mild croak through their mouth, but still continued signing as they responded with, "But Avesalon is our ally." Moore huffed a breath out through her nostrils and twirled her claws so that a lock of her long fur wrapped around it.
"That is different,"
she said a bit defensively, and averted her gaze towards the entrance to the stage.
"She has shown us time and time again that she can be trusted."
Indeed, Chris replied, acting much more calmly than she felt they had any right to be about the situation. And he is dead. Moore's eyes widened slightly, as she quickly raised her claw in a shush before glancing around, worried that someone might have taken a sneaky glance at their gestures.
"Could you not?"
she asked in a half-whisper, as she slowly settled down again, feeling like nobody had been around.
"We must be careful in case Veslon is faced with any trouble."
"I believe we have greater things to worry about than threats of the past," Chris stated, their movements still casual, as it didn't quite react to Moore's warning. "Those of flesh and blood scare me plenty at the moment. I don't need to find something else to worry about." Moore sighed, as it seemed like Chris had seen right through her. Apparently she couldn't deny it. Yes, despite Veslon's allyship, she was still rather terrified even of the very idea of realized sapience. Not that she was afraid of Veslon herself, but unlike people like Curie, James and Sheeda, who had slowly taught her that those like them were simply people and not to be feared, Veslon had simply stopped registering to her as a realized at some point, while leaving her with just as much terror of those that were like her. Maybe that was because Veslon, by her own admission, was very different from those others of her kind. Or maybe it was simply that a fear of realized was so much deeper ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist the old lady had grown up in. Whatever it may have been, the mere idea that something horrendous enough to scare even the mighty humans, even ones like the Admiral herself, down to their cores, that something like that could even remotely have the possibility to return, it left her shaken. However, on the other hand, Chris was also not wrong. Those who could stand in front of them and look into their eyes as they attacked were plenty chilling by themselves. A fact that she was quite rudely reminded of not long after, when their human guards suddenly approached, after keeping a respectful distance so far. With their breath filters removed and their faces out in the open, Moore could freely view their expressions. And since she could, she felt her heart sink a little because things seemed to be looking grim. The entire ship jumped slightly as their side was hit by the unnoticed shot of a high-speed railgun, alarms immediately blaring and informing of a decompression in one of the docking areas. In all the chaos of energy shields in hyperspace, the shot from the comparatively mundane weapon had managed to fly under the radar of their rather overloaded sensors. Thankfully, those areas were unusually empty right now, given that all ships they could send out were out in the fight right now. Still, Keown's jaw clenched. Unusually empty or not, a hit like that was not without victims. With a clear open line in between the two ships, the fire was quickly returned. Almost in that exact moment, another one of the shield generators lit up in the vacuum, causing the spraying colours of the relativity cannon's shot to crash right into the spreading energy, resulting in a huge cascade of exploding power that superheated the outer hull of the GWS and threw it at least a mile off its course, but sadly did not completely take it out of the fight. The emerging shield had only been one small part of an enormous volley, forming an impregnable wall of deadly fire that hovered across the battle space with frightening speed, threatening to consume anything that would cross its path. While the strange formations of the devices that the opposing fighters used for their own protection seemed to somehow cancel out the threat to themselves, the human pilots were left with no choice but to either evade them, jumping out of the way of the encroaching demise, as flashes of light, or fire at them to disperse the destructive shields before they could reach them. And even if they chose to flee, they had to return to the battle quickly, as without their aid, the larger ships would soon be overwhelmed by the swarming fighters of their opposition. None of which was an appealing option, considering the sheer amount of those not well understood weapons that were thrown around in this battle, because all options were corralling the pilots to move in a predictable manner, which was quite deadly if your foes knew what they were doing. In a one-on-one comparison, the human crafts held the undoubtable advantage. Protective shields or not, their technology, as well as their own physical capabilities, allowed them to be far more mobile, nimble, and precise than their opponents, while also packing a far more devastating attack. However, this dogfight wasn't one-on-one, and this battlefield wasn't so open to allow free movement. That wasn't to say that their pilots didn't hold their own out there. The officers of the UHSDF fought with every bit of the skill and tenacity that Keown could ever ask of them. However, when outnumbered 5 to 1 and forced to make the split-second decision between fight or flight every few moments, while the opponent could afford to move far more freely, even the most skilled in the world could only carry you so far. The enemy had certainly studied their tactics since the last time they had met on the fields of battle. And slowly but surely, Keown could see how their numbers were dwindling. "Sir, I would highly recommend we fall back to make better use of our range," Ensign Shaw informed him, a bead of sweat running down the side of her head as he tensely worked away on her console. Keown's scowl deepened as he once again looked over the status of the battle. Though their direct vision of the outside was still cut off, his sensors informed him that they were now less than a few miles away from the satellite. The commander clenched his teeth. The same was true for them as was for their fighters. Maneuvering and repositioning was a key part of the human battle plan, and they would have a huge advantage if they could only move as they wanted to. If only...
"We cannot fall back any further," he stated loudly. "Any further than this and we will leave the satellite wide open. We cannot allow that to happen."
Ensign Shaw exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering slightly. "Understood, sir," she replied. There was resignation in her voice, but no disagreement. Keown understood her well. Without being able to play all their cards, they were unquestionably outmatched here. The number disadvantage was simply too great. No wonder, if these were communal ships. For a long time, humanity and its few allies had stood against the rest of the galaxy. And although this battle was just a minuscule fraction of that conflict, it too represented the scale of the clash. They were fighting ferociously on all fronts, yes, and so far they managed to hold their own, even against overwhelming odds. But ultimately, that could really only last as long as the larger community decided to play fair. If at any point the gloves truly came off. After a new repositioning jump, 3 of the Unkindness-class ships dropped out of hyperspace. Floating freely with their momentum for a moment, the 3 vessels allowed it to flip them slowly so that their snouts pointed towards the incoming wall of death. Then, the 3 fired all at the same time, their heavy shots crashing into the approaching energy shields, dispersing them through the overloading impact. Then, as soon as the just as protective as it was destructive barrier fizzled out of existence, a much bigger shot followed those first 3, blasting right through the created opening and obliterating one of the opposing ships that had seemingly used a moment of perceived safety to try and turn in place, leaving it perfectly lined up to be taken out entirely. Keown glanced at the position of the flagship. Undeniably, the Trail of Tears had taken some damage. However, an Atrocity-class ship was not so easily felled. Sadly, the same could not be said for the 3rd ship that had been sent to protect the satellite. The former 9 Years was drifting away somewhere on the other side of the satellite, powered down, with one of its sides completely melted away. Quite early in the battle, during the first true moment taken by the madness of the war, after the first volleys were exchanged between the fighters, one of the enemy ships had managed to sneak one of those generators in close to the other war-class ship, leaving it to float without any propulsion, so it was hard to detect among the resulting debris. When the weapon had activated, it was already too late. Now it was unclear how many of the crew had survived, remaining trapped in a floating coffin and waiting for rescue. A rescue that Keown was ashamed to admit he may not ultimately be able to bring. With more blasts of her own cannons, the Salem cleared out those of the destructive shields that posed a direct threat to the satellite, keeping her duty to protect their communication to the rest of the galaxy down to the last man. And as soon as there was a brief break in the volley, the human fighters jumped right back into the fray, and the skirmish continued. Losses between them and their opponents were exchanged at a roughly 1 to 2 rate, which was impressive, but sadly, the numbers still didn't work out in their favour. "The weapons are starting to run hot, sir," one of his lieutenants soon informed Keown in warning. "The radiators can't compensate for this rate of fire much longer." Almost as soon as he had gotten the message out, the next volley of death spheres was already coming their way. To protect themselves from retaliatory fire, and also give their own fighters as big of an advantage as they could, the remaining communal warships were firing them in even intervals, meaning they also had to be broken through in the same rhythm to protect the satellite. Given their destructive capabilities, relativity cannons were never designed for especially drawn-out battles. Still, they could persist for an impressively long time, but in the end, toying with the forces of nature was going to take its toll. In all honesty, Keown already felt like his bones were made of rubber, just from the sheer waves that space was throwing after all the squashing and stretching it was forced to undergo during this battle alone.
"Fire till they break!"
Keown ordered, and already another heavy blast crashed against the new wave of shields.
"We don't have time to cool them down!"
He glanced at the sensors as the trail of tears managed to damage yet another enemy ship. Sadly, this time the shot wasn't enough to completely take it out, only turning a flank of the strafing vessel into conceptual matter. The fighters on both sides were thinning out. It was easier and easier to take the shot now. If they could take one of the big ships out after every volley. At this point in the battle, there were still 8 of them left, and already the Salem's weapon systems were flashing with the clear signs of danger. He could only imagine the same was true for the much more powerful cannons of the Trail of Tears. Keown exhaled slowly.
"Everyone,"
he said, standing up from his seat and standing at attention.
"It is my pleasure, honor, and privilege serving with you."
His officers remained quiet, and that was fine for him. He didn't need them to return the sentiment. He simply, genuinely, wished for them to know it. With the next volley, the alarm of the weapons system went from silent to blaring out, warning them that the temperature had reached critical levels. By now, there was a chance that the cannon's barrels had begun to melt. Now, relativity cannons were luckily not the kind of weapon that would blow up in your face if it malfunctioned. However, if the barrels really had melted, that would still render them non-functioning. And thus, it was now down to fate whether they would still be able to defend from the next volley.
"Tell the fighters to scatter and reconverge out of range," Keown then ordered. "If the weapons malfunction, it is time to retreat. Our deaths will not save the satellite either."
He knew there was not a huge chance that many of the fighters were going to make it back to the larger ships. He also knew that when they tried, there was a high chance that the Salem would be overwhelmed by enemy fighters without their further protection and her own most important weapons. However, if he was going to be forced to attempt to retreat and abandon his post, he refused to do so while leaving his pilots behind. They would retreat together or not at all. When the next volley came, he personally ordered the shots to counteract with
"Fire!"
The entire bridge went silent after he gave the command, all of them staring at their terminals, their eyes welded to their sensors. As the cannon fired up, the hyperspace rainbow of possible and impossible colors lit up the light, shooting towards the wall of shields as expected. However, no impact was registered, no surge of kinetic energy recorded, and the shields didn't dissipate. The barrels were closed. The projectiles hadn't made it out. At least for the Salem, this was the end. Keown closed his eyes. This was it. She had literally given them all she had. With a heavy heart, he opened his mouth, ready to let cooler heads prevail against his will to defend till the bitter end, and...
"All UHSDF forces! This is Fleet Admiral Santo! Retreat immediately!"
It suddenly blasted out of their communication line, leaving the entire bridge momentarily stunned as to where the order came from.
"I repeat! All UHSDF forces, retreat immediately! Gain at least 200 miles of distance in the direction of the 96th degree. You have 30 seconds to get moving!"
The stunned silence on the bridge lasted for a breath longer, as everyone seemed to be completely overwhelmed by the sudden change. However, Keown did not hesitate, bringing his fist down onto the armrest of his seat. The thundering impact of his heavy fist snapped everyone to attention as he bellowed out,
"Get us moving! Go!"
Shaking off their stupor, the officers quickly sprang into action. Gone was any notion of standing to the last soldier, as the cruiser powered up its hyperspace within seconds. From the smallest unkindness class to the atrocity flagship, none of them asked even one question, as every single one of the human vessels encased itself in blinding light and zipped away, immediately out of sight in a dazzling streak, leaving their opponents alone, almost in an instant. When the Salem emerged from its brief jump again, it was suddenly linked right into an ongoing comm chatter.
The Absolution is in position,
a deep voice announced first. The audio is in position, a slightly accented voice confirmed as well. The Gorg Agmortarhan is in position, a much higher voice called in.
The Ugorek is in position,
a quite raspy voice announced a moment later. The Cody is in position, a voice with a melodic sound to it finalized the calls. Although he was still a bit overwhelmed, Keown kept track in his mind. 5 ships, and they were all Heinousness class. This had to be...
The calculations have been triple-checked,
the Fleet Admiral's voice announced decidedly, his tone commanding even in its calmness.
Orion's arrow may be utilized. Fire in exactly 5 ticks.
Commander Keown swallowed heavily as he sank back into his seat. Orion's arrow. That it would ever be actually used in a battle.
Everyone hold on to something,
was the only thing he could advise his crew to do. As he himself held tightly onto his armrests, he could only pray that the remains of the former 9 years had drifted far enough away to not be caught in the attack. Following the Fleet Admiral's orders, all 5 of the carefully positioned battleships fired at the exact same moment at very specific angles and speeds. Ultimately, all of the shots collided at one precise point that was said to be somewhere above the center of the still buzzing enemy fleet. What happened next was impossible to perceive for human eyes. All they could see was a flash of light, followed by an enormous infernal wave of plasma fire that rivaled that of some stars spreading in all directions from the point the shots had collided. However, it was not the fire that was the attack. The fire was only the aftermath. Even before the lights of it had reached those witnessing, they were heavily shaken by what could only be described as space itself quaking. They had all felt space warp, especially during the earlier battle, but this was a different level. Not a gentle sway and waving, but a heavy shake as if existence itself was experiencing an earthquake. Those who weren't ready for it immediately collapsed, their bodies unable to cope with the unnatural experience for a couple of moments. However, though he felt the deep hit of vertigo, Keown remained on his feet. As the insane wave of hellfire slowly spread out, thinned and dispersed, he removed the dimming of the front window, wishing to see what remained with his own eyes. Slowly, the curtain of flame lifted, revealing the view that his eyes sought. They widened when the universe finally revealed what was left of the fleet. Left behind by the flames, and hovering in open space, was nothing but a sphere. Dull, grey, and with around a 100-meter radius. It gently floated there, peacefully, in complete contrast with the inferno that had emerged from its creation. A quiet grave to countless souls.